This is a drug that's taking over. It looks like it's taking over huge parts of the world, especially in the Middle East. It's killing people. It's stuffing billions of dollars into organized crime and a genocidal regime. And I never even heard of it until I heard something you were saying on another show that was kind of just a little tidbit. And I was like, wait a minute, what's Captagon? That sounds like a transformer or something. What is it?
Absolutely. I was like you and a lot of other researchers who had been studying the Middle East. Same reaction when Captagon started to become a very popular name in the mid 2010s. So I'll break it down from A to Z. Captagon's history, what it is, and kind of set the record straight on the substance. So Captagon was a drug that was a illicit substance in the pharmaceutical market in the 1960s. It was created.
So you say licit. A lot of people don't know that means. That's the opposite of illicit. It's not something you just misspoke. This was a real drug used for what?
Right. A real drug used for weight loss, attention deficit disorder. In the 1960s, again, this was something that was something similar to, Adderall and Ritalin. And it would be prescribed by doctors. It was very popular amongst, youth or sometimes, like housewives that were looking to lose weight. And in the 1980s, there were other alternatives that were popping up on the legal pharmaceutical market. And they found that Captagon, which the original formula was called phenethylene, and that Captagon was not necessarily a safe substance. There were safer substances on the pharmaceutical market. So in the mid-1980s, the World Health Organization, they scheduled it. It was removed incrementally off of the legal pharmaceutical market and phased out. Now, in the 1990s, there were a series of kind of post-Soviet pharmaceutical factories that still continued Captagon production illegally.
Okay.
A lot of those factories were concentrated in Bulgaria. And in the late 1990s, there were a lot of law enforcement crackdowns against illicit markets and illicit and organized crime networks. And then we started to see Captagon production move and then settle in the Levant region of the Middle East, particularly in Lebanon and now very much so in Syria.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you say prescribed for ADHD and weight loss, immediately I'm thinking, so is this methamphetamine or just amphetamine? Because remember Dexatrim back in the day? You might be too young to remember this, but it was basically a pill that they'd advertise on TV, and you could take it. And in Requiem for a Dream, I think that was kind of what they were hinting at this old lady was taking, which is like a weight loss drug, but it's essentially just diet meth or meth for dieting, really, or both, really. And ADHD meds are kind of just like a spin off of amphetamine as well, right?
Absolutely. And the original formula, it was an amphetamine type stimulant. But here's the catch, is that in the 1960s, the formula followed a very different kind of chemical composition. Today, what we see as Captagon or marketed as Captagon could be a range of different things. And there are so few chemical studies conducted that we found out that Captagon is pretty much whatever you make it.
Sure, okay.
Some Captagon formulas, some Captagon pills contain 0% amphetamine, and then sometimes with cutting agents of caffeine, quinine, and a number of other cutting agents and chemical additives. And then some Captagon formulas that are marketed in the Gulf, throughout the Middle East, they'll contain sometimes up to 47% amphetamine metabolized, which is quite a bit. So
that sounds like you don't want to mix those or think you're taking one and then you got the other one.
Exactly. And because this is an illicit drug and it's primarily made in Syria by actors affiliated with the Syrian regime, it's so unregulated, and the market name, I would say, speaks louder. And there's so many different variants. You can essentially put the Captagon logo, which is two kind of interlocked C's. They represent two crescent moons, and you could just put that logo on the pill. And once you have that, it's Captagon. So, it's quite interesting and kind of dangerous and concerning, given that really you can put whatever you want in this pill and market that as Captagon and people will still buy it.
I mean, it's funny that it's only, not funny, it's interesting that it's only in the Arab Gulf because, from what I understand from news sources in the Middle East, they not only don't have drugs, but they don't have gay people or any violent crime or any sort of other issues. So it's amazing that this drug seems to be making its way there when they don't apparently have a drug problem of any kind.
Well, certainly, especially in extremely conservative countries where there's a stigma of drug consumption. You have exceptions, of course, like, for example, khat or hashish. Those are very popular substances. But Captagon is a very interesting kind of beast, so to speak, in the sense that it's a drug that people take to be productive. So the stigma that you have with taking Captagon, many assume that, well, if I take Captagon and if I take it to study for my exams, or if I take it just to stave my hunger, or if I need it, I'm a truck driver and I need it to stay up for this second or third shift, then that's fine. It's not like the quote harder drugs. So because of that, there's, I would say, less of a stigma, and it's much more widespread because it could be used to be productive.
That's interesting. So taking drugs for fun, bad. Taking drugs to work yourself to death, no problem.
Oh yeah, totally, totally
Yeah.
fine.
It's interesting. I don't know if this is also in your wheelhouse, but I read about methamphetamine in North Korea, and it's kind of just everywhere. One, because you can make it from industrial chemicals, I guess, and probably a bunch of other stuff that's easier enough to obtain. So you can produce it domestically / literally in your house or your factory. But two, if you don't have food, which they don't in sufficient quantities, and you have a ton of work to do and it's all manual labor, it's kind of the perfect thing to dole out to the population, or at least allow the population to consume.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, again, I'm not necessarily an expert on methamphetamine and that illicit economy globally, but when it comes down to how this compares to Captagon, I think that it's very similar, and that's why you see this dual appeal throughout the Middle East, but among different socioeconomic classes and different socioeconomic levels. In the Levant, for example, in Lebanon and in Syria, where people are dealing with an extremely dire economic crisis and political crisis, where people are waiting in bread lines, where people are not able to, get cash from their banks. This is a very useful substance to stave your next meal, to work a second job or a third shift. It's also very reportedly popular amongst foreign worker populations in the Gulf for that same reason. But at the same time, you also have youth populations that are extremely bored. They have a bit of extra cash to spend. This is particularly the case in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and in many GCC countries where they're taking it recreationally. Sure, some are taking it for their exams, some are taking it for academic performance, but many are turning to this as a recreational drug because it gives you that rush that many people flock to.
GCC is what?
Gulf
What does that mean?
Cooperation Council.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, yeah,
So
same thing as
what does
Gulf.
that include? Okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's like Qatar. Like, what am I? Is that Saudi Arabia too? I don't know, or
Yes.
is it like UAE?
Yes. All the Gulf
Okay,
countries, it's the GCC.
gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, and but is this killing people? Because I know when I did my research, I thought, oh, this must be so deadly. Meth is so deadly, but it was hard for me to find statistics on how many people are actually dying from this. Is that because of a lack of reporting, or is it not that dangerous?
Lack of, I would say, data. That's one of the number one things is that we know a little bit about Captagon's malign health effects, but not really because we don't know exactly what is in the quote current version of Captagon. And there seems to be many different versions as well. So we don't have a lot of lab testing on the pills themselves, but then also not a lot of people are seeking help to begin with. Many are, seeking help for dependency, but we have not seen any recorded Captagon related death. But again, there is that element of stigma with many of these countries. Maybe someone has, taken a lot of Captagon and they are experiencing a health problem, but the family is saying, oh, this was a pre-existing health issue that they had before. So it's very difficult to kind of assess with the limited data we have. But we do know for a fact that given that it is an amphetamine type stimulant, long-term heavy use does, of course, lead to a series of health concerns.
So, okay, we don't know if it's killing people. It's not in North America. It's not in Europe. This is going to sound callous, but why do we really why worry about this? Why do we care? What's the problem? What's the big deal?
That's a
So
great
it's like it sounds
question.
like junky Adderall for the Middle East. I mean, we got bigger problems.
Absolutely. So I would say that one of the overriding and most significant elements of the Captagon trade, it's not necessarily, what it is and the scope of the problem, but rather who is behind it and the actors that are profiteering and using this as an alternative revenue source. So with any illicit economy, you've got this nexus with bad guys, with bad actors. And in the Middle East, the actors that are heavily associated with the Captagon trade, there's a huge spectrum, of course, but the industrial size production that we see, it's concentrated in regime-held areas of Syria, particularly with officials either directly aligned or indirectly aligned with the Assad regime. And then on top of that, I would say like the number two on the list of organized actors behind the Captagon trade would be Hezbollah. Hezbollah also supports small-scale production and trafficking operations throughout the region. And why should we care? Of course, the Syrian regime would be looking to profit and find alternative revenue streams amidst sanctions. The reason why we should care is because if sanctions are already in place, they're using this to undercut the effects of that. And they're also coordinating with illicit networks all over the world, particularly in Southern Europe, in Africa, also potentially in the Indo-Pacific, and they're also emboldening and strengthening those illicit networks. So for those that care about governance and rule of law, this is a huge, huge, huge issue.
Okay, so for people who've been under a rock for the past decade, Syria is going through a major civil war right now, is under sanctions. Their exports have fallen, like 93% or something along those lines. I mean, it's just crazy. They have no way to generate revenue. They've lost a bunch of territory. Well, essentially, they don't control a bunch of the country that they used to control. There's rebel groups. ISIS has moved in there. So you have a war zone, which makes it easier to move things around in many ways. You've got all these illicit economies, but you also have a regime that's desperate for money to keep funding the weapons it uses against its own people. And you've got the idea that these networks are now reaching out to other I think the problem that a lot of people don't really understand, and it took me years to sort of absorb this as well, is that when you have an organized crime network pop up in a war zone or start operating in a war zone, it's kind of like a cancer, right? It doesn't just mess with the country that it's in. It reaches out and says, let's talk to the Balkan gangsters. And then let's talk to this mafia, that mafia. Let's start human trafficking while we're at it. And hey, we're moving people. Let's move some guns. We're moving drugs, guns, and people. Why don't we deal with the terrorists? I mean, they have money too, and we have guns now, and we're not really supposed to do that, but who cares? It's money. You're not dealing with the sort of moral actor, I use that in air quotes. You're not even necessarily dealing with governments right at this point. You're dealing with criminals who think, I don't care if I get my $1 million from ISIS or if I get it from Syria or if I get it from Jordanian smugglers. So it sort of metastasizes and spreads all over the place. And even if that war zone, if that conflict dies down, you've got all these ties from one mafia in one region to another, and they don't want to just pack up and go home. They just get into other businesses. So that is, I think, is one of the reasons why we should care about stuff like this.
Right.
Am I on point here?
I think you hit the nail on the head. And then on top of that, too, is that, yes, we have Hezbollah, we have these non-state actors, but what happens when
What's
you
Hezbollah
get
for people also who aren't familiar
Of course.
with that?
Hezbollah is a designated terrorist organization that operates primarily in Lebanon, but of course has also established some small presence in southern Syria. They're a designated terrorist organization by the United States. They very much capitalized on the landscape after the Lebanese Civil War, and they're a militant group and also a considerable political force within Lebanon. They collaborate very closely with the Syrian regime. Also, they have some alliances to Iran as well. And so, to your point about why we should care, not only, is this something that, of course, spreads and undermines rule of law all across the international community, but also when you have
an actor that is a state actor. They have the resources, they have the networks, they have access to ports, they have access to checkpoints, they have everything that they could dream of in terms of helping sustain the industrial sized growth of an illicit trade like Captagon. It's really difficult to stop it. And then on top of that, then they have this plausible deniability narrative that they've very much carried out in the country. And also it's become a leverage card and a kind of pressure tactic that they have mounted against some of their regional neighbors. If they say, oh, you don't like the Captagon trade, well, how about we arm smugglers and we increase the risk of violence and agitation along your border? It's a really great tool and a really great card to play in discussions and negotiations with other countries.
I had not thought about that. That's kind of, so you're saying, it sounds like you're saying that Jordan, for example, which borders Syria, might say, hey, man, we don't really like the fact that you're doing, well, you're killing your own people. And they say, cool, we don't care about you. We're going to run armed smuggling gangs over your border and kill border soldiers, which I've heard has happened recently, which, of course, pisses off the regime. But it's almost like covert, or it's almost like a war tactic in a way, or like a conflict in and of itself, where you're running smugglers over the border and you're just not doing anything about it, even if you could. And your neighbors are weaker for it because now they have to focus on border security, when before maybe that wasn't such an issue.
Right. I think that it's a card that they can play, and then also something where, they can also shrug and say, well, this is out of our control, so that's been really useful for them. And as long as they're conducting an occasional seizure here and there, the regime thinks that they are able to then create that narrative of, see, that's someone else's problem. These are other actors that are operating within Syria. It's only amongst terrorists and opposition forces. But I will say it sometimes has shot the regime, they've shot themselves in the foot by going too hard with putting pressure on their neighbors with Captagon. For example, Jordan was pursuing, or at least experimenting with normalization with Syria throughout the summer of 2021. And they opened the border crossing along their border with Syria. And after that, they saw a flood of Captagon smuggling operations come through. A lot of them were violent. It killed one Jordanian captain. It got really, really ugly. And that's when the Jordanian government started to pump the brakes on normalization with Syria. So I will say that, as much agency as the Syrian government has had over this narrative, it sometimes has come back to bite them.
Oh, I see. So instead of saying we actually want to trade and export things through this border, they just ran a bunch of drugs through it. And until the Jordanian government said, maybe you guys are just kind of being dicks and we don't really want to deal with you at all. And now the border's closed again.
Yeah, well, the border crossing itself hasn't necessarily been closed, but the Jordanians have essentially pumped the brakes on a number of other normalization initiatives.
Oh, I see.
And they were
I
like,
see.
instead of talking directly to the Syrian regime, although communication channels they do exist, they tried to talk to the Russians, for example, who were in the area, and asked them to try and get these smugglers to cut it out instead of directly through the regime. But now we're starting to see Captagon kind of climb the ladder in terms of how high it's prioritized on normalization discussion lists. And Captagon, in many cases, is taking that number one spot.
It almost sounds like the U.S. and Mexico with the drug war, right? We've got border issues. It seems to be at the top of the agenda alongside auto manufacturing and other issues. It's like you can't have a conversation with Mexico, which was one of our largest trading partners and one of our largest sources of back and forth trade. Of course, it always includes the drug issue now. And it seems like the Assad regime maybe let this get a little bit too big. I mean, how much money are we talking about going to the regime from Captagon? Do we know?
That's a great question. I think that we've seen a number of different estimates put out there. For example, the report that we authored, that was looking at the trade in 2021. We put $5.7 billion, which is pretty sizable and multiple sizes larger than Syria's licit exports.
Really?
Yeah.
So the drug trade for Syria is multiple times larger than their actual legitimate product
Yes.
exports.
But I would caveat and say that most of it is coming from Syria. And we estimated that, the bulk of industrial sized Captagon shipments are coming from Syria. But we have seen some smaller labs pop up in Lebanon. There is the potential. We saw very small evidence that there was one right outside of Amman in Jordan. So it's starting to grow a little bit more. However, the large majority is concentrated inside Syria. Now, as to how much this is worth, it's a really big guessing game. AFP, which is a Agence France Presse, they put out an estimate in this past fall, which I thought was really, really accurate. And that was estimating the entire size of the trade, not just what is seized, but what really could be out there. And they put it at 10 billion. But we have seen some larger estimates, but so it's really, really difficult to ascertain exactly how much it can be, given the fact that we're seizing a certain amount, but there is likely that's the tip of the iceberg. And there might be other pills that are trickling through that are undetected by law enforcement. So we've seen some experts and some different institutions try and gauge how much exactly that could be. It's an even harder intellectual and mathematic exercise trying to figure out how much the regime is getting from that. Because as the Captagon trade expands, the more middlemen you tack on, the more networks are becoming involved. And it's hard to guess and to determine exactly how much the producers and the primary traffickers are making from this. But I would say safely, this is a huge alternative revenue source, extremely lucrative, and will therefore be very hard for them to give up.
What's the cocaine trade by way of comparison? Do you know?
Yes. Yeah. 110, 130 billion, I would say.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is like roughly, let's say 10% of the cocaine trade, which has armies and submarines and aircraft and huge cartels operating internationally. So it might sound small compared to cocaine, but we're also talking about a much smaller area with a much smaller market. And if that's saying something, that's essentially the chief export. But that begs the question, okay, if this is something that I just assumed was cooked up in small facilities, you're not cooking up $10 billion worth of a cheap drug in a small facility. The production of this, especially if it's one of Syria's chief exports, has to be literally, no exaggeration, a massive industrial scale operation. I mean, there have to be factories that were making, I don't know, headache medicine that are now just making Captagon. Right?
That's what we identified in the report. I mean, certainly you have kind of a spectrum of production facilities and capabilities throughout the region. But what we started to pick up in 2020 and 2021 was just exactly that. In the 1970s and 80s, Syria had its heyday of being one of the largest pharmaceutical hubs in the region. And if you look at recent UN data, it shows that Syria, right before the war, was one of the largest importers of a drug called pseudoephedrine, which is used for, cough and cold medicine. So like, if you think of Mucinex or Robitussin, medicines like that. Yeah, exactly. And that could be used, we suspect, in Captagon production processes and manufacturing processes. And the scale of some of these Captagon production sites, through the reports that we were able to glean in the report, do show that this is pretty large scale. And not only large scale in terms of production, but can you imagine transporting millions of Captagon pills on, for example, a commercial, a vessel, or, trying to dispatch that through overland routes. It requires a lot of logistical planning and some pretty advanced and impressive shrouding techniques and smuggling techniques. I mean, it's huge.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about that because I'm looking at some of these seizures, and there's one in a single day, July 1st, 2020, 84 million pills were found confiscated in the port of Salerno, Italy. The street value of that was €1 billion. So my first question is, isn't that like enough Captagon for every man, woman, and child in the entire country? Or multiple countries in the area? These are not big places. You could get everybody high for a day in the whole region, practically at that. It just shows how many people are using these.
Well, yes, but also we're curious as well. And this was a question that I haven't really been able to answer yet, but especially, that was to Italy, and it was suspected that it would be rerouted back into the Gulf potentially because the consumption markets don't quite exist there in Southern Europe so far. So there is the potential that, once these are getting to these destination countries in the Gulf, perhaps they could be also dispatched to a next destination. That's definitely possible. Consumption definitely has been proven in a lot of these destination markets, but I have that exact question sometimes where it's like, wait a second, like we're sending more than is needed in some cases in terms of unless every single individual in some of these countries are consuming Captagon, and it's very difficult to store it for a very long time because it loses its potency. So there is that question of, wait a second, what are we missing here? Unless people are taking 3 or 4 Captagon pills a day, which would be terrible and is not likely, where is all of this going? Are you just storing it in warehouses? And that's one of the lingering questions that I have when I look at this trade, especially as we see shipments just get larger and larger and larger.
I don't imagine that drug traffickers like storing billions of dollars in product somewhere where it could get seized and then they just keep buying more. That doesn't make sense to me. When you smuggle cocaine in someplace, and I'm no expert here, but if you're bringing cocaine into the United States, the last thing you want to do is go, all right, that's brick number 75, throw it in the garage with the rest of them. I mean, you want to move that stuff as fast as possible. 1, so you can get your money, and 2, so you can keep the heat off of you and not have this in your possession. So somebody has to be taking it or reselling it or moving it somewhere else, and they just haven't caught where it's going. I mean, could it be moved from the Gulf to Africa? Is it being taken by people who are fighting civil wars somewhere else that we're just not paying attention to? I don't know. How likely is that?
Oh, I think extremely likely. And I think, when we get into the context of some of these other conflict zones that exist, near the Horn or, in the Sahel or in Northern Africa, it's even harder to track. So, that's been something that I think deserves a lot more research and a lot more attention because we have had some limited evidence of Captagon winding up and being stored in Libya. We've had some evidence of Captagon being seized in Nigeria. And, again, to your point and what we talked about previously about empowering other illicit networks, that same seizure, the Port of Salerno seizure that you're talking about that was conducted in July 2020, guess who was supposed to receive that? And guess who was supposed to facilitate that? A mafia group called the Camorra.
Wow.
There's an Italian mafia group that is working and engaging with directly with Syrian regime aligned actors to receive a drug shipment. So, it just goes to show that as they're looking to expand this market, especially if they have more pills than they know what to do with, that is going to undermine and empower a lot of these other, quote, bad guys and malign actors out there in the international community.
Are you worried at all that since the Italian mafia and the Balkan mafia are already touching the stuff? So wait, let me back up. Why ship it to Europe just to ship it back into the Gulf? Is that because if it's coming from Syria, it's probably drugs at this point? I mean, statistically speaking, it's more likely drugs than not drugs. So you ship it to Italy and then it comes back and it looks like, I don't know, IKEA furniture or something like that. Is that the plan?
That's actually a great way to phrase it. Yeah, I mean, essentially it all comes down to suspicion. There's only so many times that you can send a Captagon shipment out of the port of Beirut or the port of Latakia without things starting to become a little fishy, especially with, GCC states that are now starting to wake up in terms of the challenge of Captagon. So yeah, as soon as you get that EU stamp, it's the same reason why we've seen Captagon wind up, for example, at the port of Klang in Malaysia. You want to get that stamp that shrouds suspicion and makes these shipments look a lot less suspicious.
Okay, so if we're shipping it to the Balkans and we're shipping it to Italy and the mafias, which are no joke in the Balkans, I know the Italian mafia is not what it used to be, or, whatever, the good old days were the 60s, 70s, 80s, I guess, but, or maybe even earlier over there. if they're touching the stuff, are we worried at all that they're going to then go, hey, you know, shipping it is profitable, but you know, it's really profitable selling it at retail prices in the area where we live? Are you worried that they're going to develop a market there? Because Europeans have a lot of money, and they certainly have more money than, let's say, at developing a market in Africa for this. So it would be pretty profitable if they just kept a bunch of it instead of shipping it onward and sold it at retail prices instead of, I don't know, wholesaling it to the next destination.
It's possible. I mean, I haven't necessarily seen evidence of that happening just yet. Although I will say, and I wrote something recently on this, that when I was looking at my data from 2022, I did see an uptick in Captagon shipments over land, not through commercial, vessels or anything like that, but overland through Turkey. And a lot of the law enforcement systems and law enforcement officials in Turkey that would seize Captagon, they said, hey, this is destined for European countries. They never said which one, which was not helpful. And you never know, maybe it was actually destined for the Gulf or somewhere else. And maybe they were just saying that to say that. But that was a very notable trend that we saw in 2022. So I think it's entirely possible that Europe could be targeted as a market for this drug. But there's just no way to know about how successful its appeal will have.
Yeah, I mean, look, you don't have to stretch to make me right if I'm not right, but it does seem like the kind of thing a country would say, like, oh, our people aren't taking this. This was going to Germany. That's where this was headed. We don't take Captagon over here. We have God-fearing people over here in Turkey. I mean, maybe they're right, maybe they're not, or maybe who knows? It's hard to say. But again, you don't have to stretch just because I made a guess that happens to be wrong. Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show. So how do they ship this stuff? I assume you don't just crack open a container and a bunch of pills spill out. What's the smuggling method they're using?
Well, actually, we have seen a few shipments where it is, you just do a quick little poke through the packaging material. That, for example, the
That sounds
cardboard,
lazy.
I know. Well, that was back in 2020. So since then,
Okay.
they've gotten like absolutely wild with the seizure materials that they've used. Port Salerno was cardboard cylinders, like industrial size. They were massive. But yeah, you go through and then it was just all packed throughout there. But I've seen, now it feels like everything under the sun. I've seen Captagon shrouded inside of fruit, inside of pomegranate skins, which, can you imagine like the technique of
Wow.
someone, putting it inside of pomegranates? I've seen it shrouded inside and disguised as like chickpeas, like 2 or 3 pills together. And then they put this like mesh overlay over to make it look like they were chickpeas. We've
Oh my
seen it
God.
inside of lemons. We've seen it inside of oranges, inside of fake oranges. Like they got plastic oranges and put it inside that. We've seen
But
it
who
inside of.
orders like 10 million fake oranges?
I
They're like, oh,
know.
your fake oranges have arrived, sir. Thank God.
I
We've been
know.
sitting on these fruit bowls with plastic bananas and plastic apples for months now.
I
Thank God these
know.
have arrived.
I know. And part of me like thinks that some of these guys are just like doing this to I don't know, have
Troll.
fun with it. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Because at this point it's like whatever. And always, especially with these like very flashy ones, they're shipped in these like huge sizes, which is pretty risky if you think about it. So I feel like sometimes there's like this at the board meeting of Captagon smugglers, they probably are like, all right, guys, let's do oranges this year. Let's do
Gosh.
sheep guts. Like they packaged it in the carcasses
Sheep
of
guts.
livestock. Yeah,
Oh gosh.
I know.
But then what's gross is then do people then eat the carcass of the livestock? Is it for consumption?
I don't think so. I don't
Oh,
know,
good.
actually. I don't know. There have been 2 instances of it like being inside of dead sheep, but I
But
don't know
what do
whether
you
it was
use
for,
dead sheep for if not? I don't know. Maybe I'm out of the
maybe
loop
it's
on that
to
one.
like, yeah, maybe it is for consumption. But yeah, it's pretty wild. We saw something inside of like olive oil containers, inside of like car parts. Anyways, the list can go on.
Wow. That's shocking. The pomegranate in fruit stuff is amazing because the amount of manual labor, like you said, can you imagine somebody putting Captagon pills into a pomegranate? The amount of manual labor involved in that is enormous. I mean, you would need thousands of people sitting in a row shoving Captagon tablets into tens of thousands or whatever, hundreds of thousands of pomegranates because they rot, right? So you can't just do them slowly over time and then ship a rotten, shriveled pomegranate. You got to do it in a couple of days. So you take out all those seeds, which anybody who's ever eaten a pomegranate already realizes is a huge pain in the ass. You do something with the seeds. Hopefully they get consumed and not just wasted, but whatever. And then you shove tablets into that space in the pomegranate, or is the whole thing hollowed out and just full of pills?
For what I saw in the pictures, the whole thing was hollowed out and then filled with pills. However,
that makes it easier.
on that same kind of wavelength, there was a seizure that was conducted inside of Syria where they had them inside of olive pits. So still trying to keep the olives intact. And can you imagine just putting 1 to 2 pills in that space? Still a lot of work.
Okay.
And yeah. So it's pretty incredible.
I'm going to throw something out there, and I don't want to give anybody ideas, but I'm sure they're better at this than me, given the fact that they've made $10 billion a year off this stuff. They got to be using machines, right? You throw the olives into a machine. It's supposed to put the pimento in there or whatever, the little red thing. Maybe it just takes the pit out. Instead of pimentos, they've rigged it so it puts Captagon pills in there. Because I can't imagine the manual labor involved in that. Otherwise, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I know. I'm starting to think about everything on our seizure database. They put stuff inside of canned lids.
Lids?
Yeah, tomato paste lids. So they would put it under inside, and then they would put another layer or a seal over it, and they would have it inside of the lids. It's they're really, really, really advanced and always very entrepreneurial in terms of what is being found with Captagon inside. It's never usually just a bag. Although sometimes you see that with smuggling, overland smuggling.
It's got to be really hard to find stuff like this. I know some of the seizures that I looked at, they were stuffed into washing machines. So you're not going to take apart a washing machine. I guess if you have a drug-sniffing dog and it realizes something is amiss, you take it apart. But although if you're just a human looking at it, there's no freaking way you're finding it in a refrigerator or an air conditioning unit. You're just not going to look inside.
Yeah. Yeah. Unless you have X-ray machine, and unless you're putting everything through there. I mean, it's pretty amazing that, so much has been detected, but I think it just goes to show how it is very difficult for law enforcement systems to, be on top of this. And then on top of that, you also have, you do have tip-offs, and sometimes you do have intelligence passed on, but there's a lot of distrust amongst neighbors in the Middle East. So you don't really have that level of coordination that you would want. That phone call that says, hey, this is coming from Port of Beirut. We suspect that this could, have, X amount of Captagon pills inside. Definitely check it when it arrives at the port of Haditha or the port of Jeddah or something. That I think is lacking in the region.
I looked up Syria's legal exports, and this is a couple years old, but it was 860 million. So if you're talking about 860 million, so not even a billion, let's say it's a billion now, and you're talking about almost 10 billion for the Captagon trade, this is 10 times their legal exports. So this has to be the top revenue generator for the entire country at this point. Is that correct? Or am I overstating that?
It's hard to ascertain. I would say absolutely, but in terms of the level of state involvement that is implicated in Captagon production and trafficking, it's a major, major, major revenue source. Without the receipts of what's being rerouted back into the pockets of these producers and traffickers, how much is being paid to these traffickers as well, how much it takes for production to take place. It's really difficult to just know exactly how much, but it definitely, as you mentioned, it's larger than their illicit exports, which just is pretty incredible.
So is this a mafia in Syria doing this, or are we talking about the regime itself has its own government officials doing this? Like when we talk about North Korea, you see North Korean diplomats doing stuff like smuggling heroin. Are we seeing that with Syria, or are we seeing mafia groups that may or may not be kind of tangentially attached to Assad's cousin's friends from college or whatever. I
Yeah.
mean, how close are we talking?
Well, I would say it's definitely like this very complex landscape that exists in terms of Captagon production. You have a group, for example, some of the traffickers we see along the Syrian Jordanian border. They had been doing, trafficking and smuggling for centuries, for generations. A lot of these are, these tribal entities and families that, traded cigarettes over the border or arms. And, today it's Captagon because that is in high demand. However, you also have some of these groups of narco entrepreneurs, I would call them, individuals that are, deeply embedded in Syria's business and agricultural sector that have, these connections. They have these shell companies that exist abroad that the regime or, these major Captagon producers can tap into to transport Captagon out of the country. But then you have I would say, top tier level where, it isn't necessarily a directive that the Syrian government or Bashar al-Assad himself has created, but you are pretty close because you have, for example, one of his direct cousins, Wasim Badia al-Assad, who's been a noted Captagon producer and trafficker. And then most notably, his brother, Maher al-Assad, is heavily implicated in Captagon production and trafficking. And he also just so happens to head the regime's most, I would say, prestigious and formidable security apparatus and security arm, which is called the 4th Division. And the 4th Division is extremely well equipped and has been very heavily associated with Captagon production and trafficking.
So it sounds like the state is really not just complicit, but is intertwined with this completely. When you have the military's elite units providing security and helping smuggle, and you have the president's brother doing this, and the president, especially when it's a dictatorship, that's not like, oh, the guy was in this other business beforehand. I mean, Assad's been in charge of the country they've been in charge for generations at this point. So
Yeah.
this is not something he just cooked up, no pun intended, in the last couple of years. This is something that's always been there. Okay.
Absolutely.
Wow. So, and I would imagine there's also an element of Assad keeping the smugglers and the mafia groups as allies if they control certain areas of the country. I know we did an episode about the Dictator's Handbook with Alistair Smith, episode 794 and 795. And one of the things he brought up was dictators often have organized crime figures around them because those people have real power in the country, and dictators have they have their cronies around them, and they have to keep those people happy. They don't have to keep the population happy. Those aren't really the stakeholders. They have to take the people with real power. So organized crime groups, kleptocrats, and rich people, essentially, elites, happy. And so I would imagine if there's that much money in this, then everybody who's got any power at all is probably getting their hands into Captagon in Syria.
Exactly. I mean, you look at some of the biggest magnets of Syria's telecommunications sector, their agricultural sector, on other industrial production sectors. For example, the cardboard cylinders that were used at the Port of Salerno that happened to be from a very close regime and Assad family ally who provided the cardboard cylinders for that. Everyone is playing a part, whether that is providing a truck or providing shrouding materials or providing a facility to make Captagon or even directly overseeing the production process. And I would say that you're absolutely right in the sense that, the Assad regime, this is multi-generational, and a lot of these same, big figures have been around for a long time, or, perhaps their families have been very prominent in this particular business sector. And, already the Syrian business landscape and their political landscape was already corrupt to begin with. But now this adds that, I would say, a huge layer of complicity and corruption and coordination. I would say it is notable, though, to keep that narrative of plausible deniability. So you have the 4th Division, you've got Assad's very own brother running a lot of these operations. But then you also have a very active Ministry of Interior that is conducting seizures wherever they can. And these seizures are much, much smaller. You know, sometimes you'll see some of these seizure reports and they're like sometimes 3 to 5 pills. Sometimes they'll announce a
3
really
to 5
large
pills?
Yes, yes. And they're
Oh,
putting that
wow.
up
Okay.
there, right? Compared to like the millions that we're seeing seized in the Gulf. It's interesting. Also very interesting when compared to the fact that Syria is the largest hub of production. So when you're only getting 5 pills, there's a lot underneath the surface there that they know is being produced, but they're not going after it. And then on top of that, you know, some of these seizures that we've seen, they're a bit wonky as well. For example, Syria announced that they found Captagon, Captagon powder in the form of hummus bowls, like pottery bowls that
Oh,
they
wow.
found, which is very difficult to assess if that's possible. So
Huh.
you have this kind of balancing act that you can see that the regime is trying to wage to offload that blame, to say, look, we're doing all that we can, and also to kind of create that space between what the government ministry is doing, but then also, of course, some of these other security actors and business actors that are closely aligned, but they're operating independently.
Man, yeah, I'm looking at some of these stats. In 2020, the United Nations registered that Syria had imported 50 tons of an important basic ingredient for the production of Captagon. That's a lot, right? The chemical is pseudoephedrine, which you mentioned before, that they use in cold medicines and crystal meth. 50 tons. And I looked up like, okay, well, is that a lot? Because I know other places that make pharmaceuticals, they've got to be importing it. Are they importing 5,000 tons? I don't know. No, 50 tons is about, it's a little more than half of the amount imported by Switzerland, which has a massive pharmaceuticals industry that's legitimate. So if you're importing, let's say 50% of what Switzerland is importing, but you're exporting no legitimate or very little legitimate pharmaceuticals, and Switzerland is putting stuff all over the world, you're importing a shitload of pseudoephedrine, for lack of a better term. It's just a huge amount in scale.
Yeah, it's extremely, and they haven't changed those, you know, the levels of what has been requested since the advent of the Civil War. So it's very difficult to gauge just how much is coming in, and likely also they likely have a lot of stockpiled precursor materials from before the war began as well. So, and they have these facilities, especially in areas that were not as affected by the violence of the Civil War. You know, a lot of those hubs still exist. So yeah, they have a huge production capacity that is notable. And I would say a lot of governments are starting to wake up to.
It seems, how much does Captagon cost if you try to buy it in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, because you got a party to go to or what, or you've got exams? How much are we talking about?
Yeah, of course. You know, it depends on where you're buying it, how
Well, yeah,
close
you
you
need a
are
good-
to
you need a good hookup.
production. Exactly.
Gotta have a
You need to
good
get the
plug.
hookup. Exactly. And it also depends on like what sort of pill you're buying. But you know, what's most common in the Gulf, at least over the last 2 years, has been the Lexus variant, which is a white variant of Captagon. I say Lexus because they have it in a Lexus logo on the plastic bags. Usually it's like this metallic silver or gold Lexus logo. As a researcher on Captagon, I now cannot drive on the road without seeing a Lexus car and being like, oh, that's a Captagon car. But Lexus is the most popular in Saudi Arabia. Typically, pills cost anywhere between like $10 or sometimes up to $25 per pill that's been recorded on the market, which is pretty crazy. But of course, there are cheaper variants that exist. There's a yellow, like a mealy yellow pill that has a smaller concentration of amphetamine. And then also we recorded like a pink strawberry tinted Captagon pill. We're starting to see a pill that's a bit more brown and like rusty looking, which is doesn't bode well for public health.
That sounds gross.
Yeah, it sounds really gross. And it's very difficult to kind of ascertain how much those pills are going for. And we've also seen that those pills are a bit more popular closer to production sites. So in Syria and Lebanon and Jordan.
So I know that it's impossible to get sort of international cooperation, real international cooperation with a place like Syria, because it's a dictatorship. The ruling family controls the drug trade and the judiciary and the law enforcement system, right? So you're not gonna get like, what is it, Interpol going in there to supervise operations, right? It's just not going to happen.
Well, no. And then I would also mention Interpol accepted Syria into their red notice alert system in the
Tell us what
last
that is.
year. So whenever the Interpol's red alert system essentially is that if you're part of this notification system, you're allowed to request Interpol. If there's a warrant for arrest, if there's someone that your government wants to arrest, that essentially facilitates countries and wherever that individual might be, they will cooperate to arrest them. We haven't seen that red notice system heavily used by Syrian authorities against opposition forces, luckily. But we are starting to see Interpol normalize and open a door back to Syrian authorities after all this time. They say that this was a decision that was not politically motivated, and they said that the Syrian regime has proven itself to be, a suitable readmission back to the red notice system. However, we've also seen Interpol begin to include the Syrian regime in dialogues on counter-narcotics policy. So, for example, Operation Lionfish, which focuses on Captagon as a part of that operation, they've invited the Syrian regime to sit down at the table and have a chat about what the regime can do to counter narcotics, illicit narcotics like Captagon.
That's ridiculous. Like, well, look, I understand if we include a place that has a drug or narco trafficking problem. Like, we want to involve Mexico in dialogue with the United States because we both have narco trafficking problems and drug problems. But when it's the state actually doing it, and it's the dictator actually doing it, and the law enforcement agencies and military actually doing the trafficking, that seems a little bit like a bridge too far. At what point do you just realize that they're completely full of it, lying to you, everything's performative, and they're going to try and derail your efforts? And they've got an inside man on every meeting where you're making plans on how to derail their operations. It makes that, to me, just seems dangerously naive to the point of stupidity.
Yeah, it's starting to become, this same kind of line of thinking has started to really affect a lot of other geopolitical developments as well. For example, a lot of countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, even Jordan to an extent, Egypt, they're starting to toy with the idea of real normalization with Syria. And that means, your embassy is reopened back in the capital city, send an ambassador, you've got full-blown, revived relations. You try and revive commercial relations, political relations, everything. And what is at the top of the agenda on things that they could potentially cooperate with the regime on? Captagon. Which, there have been a number of experts and also, of course, the data shows that, well, if the regime is in a large part an agent in the Captagon trade, they have agency to stop it, but they also have, I would say, probably more of an incentive to keep that up, given that it's such a formidable revenue stream. What makes you think that they will just cut it out? There is, of course, the incentive to normalize relations and to restore credibility and legitimacy. But in my opinion, I think that the regime is looking at this whole landscape and thinking that they can accomplish both. They can have their cake and eat it too. And so it's hard watching all of these countries put that on the top of the agenda list. So,
yeah, nobody's going to say, fine, I do want diplomatic relations with my neighbors. I'm going to cut my revenue down by 90% in order to do that. That's ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. You'd rather just be a pariah but able to fund your military and stay in power than not be able to do any of those things, probably end up getting executed or shot in your own house while you're sleeping or something.
right.
But hey, we got an embassy from Qatar now reopened. That's a victory. I mean, no leader, no dictator worth their salt is going to take that deal at all.
Right. And on top of that, too, what I would imagine as well, what has been discussed or at least could potentially happen is, let's say some countries think that then, if that's the case, if the Assad regime isn't going to back down that easily, well, then just sweeten the deal and offer them a financial package that will, quote, make up for Captagon revenues. Well, then the regime will then just take both of that, and then they'll say,
Right, yeah.
"Oh, well, the Captagon trade is continuing." Well, that's not us. Those are the terrorists and opposition forces that are carrying out
Yeah.
Captagon
In fact, give us
production,
a
not
little bit
us.
more money and we'll be able to fight those guys too. Just
Exactly.
instead of giving us $10 billion, give us 15 and we'll make sure that those pesky terrorists that are generating $10 billion a year for us are out of business. I mean, none of it makes any sense. It boggles the mind, and it really makes me lose faith in organizations like Interpol or the UN who do so much good work. When I just think, what are you smoking where this is possibly going to work out for you at all? It's so dumb.
Yeah, it's been very difficult to kind of see that very fine line that needs to be walked in respect to Syria. I think that there is a limit between objectivity, but then also, of course, knowing that the regime is an agent behind the Captagon trade, and welcoming them into the fold with serious collaboration. I think it's always important to keep a communication line open, but inviting them to the actual table for negotiation over Captagon interdictions, it's a bridge too far, I would say.
So is there anything positive you can leave us with? We see from the war in Ukraine, Putin invaded Ukraine, and we see the West and NATO being stronger and the European alliances are stronger. Is the Captagon thing going to be similar where, all right, Captagon, bad news, not going to make any real headway there, but on the plus side, maybe there's better drug cooperation between European countries, Africa, the Middle East, and the United States?
Yeah, I actually do. I am encouraged by some of the recent steps that have been made on Captagon, and having kind of rung this alarm bell for a few years now, I am starting to see greater transatlantic cooperation between the United States, the UK, and even the EU. They all just within a matter of weeks announced sanctions targeting individual Captagon producers and traffickers affiliated with the Syrian regime and Hezbollah. That's great. And I think we are starting to make way towards a mechanism where the United States, the UK, and the EU could help and provide resources and technical expertise and best practices to the states that need to confront the Captagon trade, that need to reduce both supply and demand. And I think that we're getting there. I actually think that there is appetite to do that. And now there's a recognition of Captagon as a huge challenge. We didn't have that a few years ago. People now know what Captagon is. However, the Syrian regime is being normalized, and the Captagon trade is, at the top of that agenda item list. And because of that, I do think that it may make some things a bit tricky, but I do think that we're moving slowly and incrementally towards greater regional cooperation, which all in all is a plus.
Caroline Rose, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jordan.
Thanks for checking out this entire episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There, we dive even deeper on this and many other topics. In the audio podcast, I also close open loops, cover things discussed off camera, off air, and give some parting lessons from our guest. You can find The Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcast app, or at jordanharbinger.com. And also, if you found this episode useful, please share it with those you care about. Last but not least, like, comment, and subscribe.